I have definitely not done anything by 9:40 in the morning to deserve that ever in my life, let alone today. So thank you very, very, very much for being so nice. Thanks.
Her first words when she stepped out of the car were to thank us for having her here. Yeah. It's wonderful. I'm going to start off by asking a few questions, engaging in a bit of a conversation, and then after a little while, we have a number of students who are prepared with questions, and then after that, we will open to your questions, and you'll have an opportunity to speak to Rachel Maddow directly. I'm going to start off by noting something that's very obvious to those of us who turn on at 9 o'clock every evening, and that is that what comes through is a love, a zest, a buoyancy, an energy that really defines who you are, I guess, in many ways. And I'm sure it's love for that job and for the subjects that you're dealing with. But would you talk a little bit about where that comes from in you? And I mean, were you one of these kids who everything that your parents suggested you do, you say, yes, gotta do it. You know, yes, I want to go here, I want to go there. Is that just who you are?
No, not at all. The right person to ask about this is probably Julia, who knows the deep, dark truth about me, which is that I am a total grump. I am a grump and a depressive. And nobody believes this is about me, but it's true. If the world has a silver lining, I am the deep dark cloud within it. But I do love my job. I think that, and I felt this way about being on the radio too. I never set out to be in media. I got my first media job. I applied for an on-air morning zoo sidekick job on a dare from friends who listened to that show. They were doing open on-air auditions, so I just went. And doing that, when I really thought that I was going to have a totally different life, did sort of make something click for me. And it feels like a great privilege and just a hoot to be able to broadcast, whether it's on the radio or whether it's on the TV, to be able to say stuff and have people listen on purpose, not because they have to, but because they can. It is exciting. It is exciting and happy-making, even when you're dealing with both hard work and tough news.
Who is it you're talking to? Who do you envision?
I don't.
When you're sitting there looking at the camera or talking into the mic.
It's a good question, and it's key to the psychotic psychology of what it is to do my job. Because when I'm in the TV studio, there's a really nice stage manager named Rob in sweatpants, and there's another guy who drives the camera that's on the big stick that makes the big long panning motions. His name is Eddie. And then that's it. There are other cameras in the studio that are driven by robots. Julia is on the newsroom side of the room. She's over there in case something happens and something needs to be physically moved around. And really, there's nobody there. I'm staring into mostly a robotically operated camera being controlled by a guy named Mike 3 doors down. And that is very, very freeing to me. I'm trying to say what I think is true, sort of for my own benefit, with the great, gleeful knowledge that there are other people who can tap into it if they want to. But I'm not imagining myself talking to any one person when I'm doing it. And I think other people who do the job do it differently. I think people have an audience in mind, but I'm not thinking about it. I'm trying to do a perfect broadcast.
So do you think of that as, it's interesting, and I think of you as not a professor, but as someone who's taken that role in a very pedagogical way. Mm. It's like a mini class in whatever the subject is that you have, it looks as if you have researched in great detail, and you want to get those lessons across, and you'll repeat what the important point is in a number of ways so that people understand it. So do you think of it as a teaching to this
I guess
camera?
I think of it as explaining, I guess. You know how when you have subject matter expertise in something, at least a base level, but then you have to explain to somebody or teach to somebody a specific part of it, it makes the necessity of explaining it to somebody else makes you learn it more deeply.
Right.
Richard Feynman, the great physicist, writes about this when he talked about having won the Nobel Prize in physics, having taken part in the development of the atomic bomb, having done all this, knowing people on a first-name basis like Niels Bohr, who had been his heroes in terms of defining what physics is and all of this stuff. And he talks about the great challenge of his life as a physicist and a teacher was explaining what he won the Nobel Prize in physics for to the wife of his friend who had no scientific background or whatever, and had done this nice thing where she cooked for him after he had to have surgery once. And his great mission in life was to make her understand this incredibly complicated physics and nanoparticles and all this stuff for which he won the Nobel Prize. And he talked about how it made him learn so much more about what he already knew in order to be able to explain it. And out of that project of trying to educate his friend's wife because she asked, he put together this weeks-long series of lectures that he ended up giving at Caltech to Caltech undergrads that are still the best thing you've ever heard in your life about physics. You can actually get them on CD. I listen to them when I'm driving around because I'm that much of a nerd.
Really?
But it's 1960, and you can hear all these Caltech undergrads, all men, right? Because 1960 at Caltech, and they're all physicists, and they're all interested in the subject, and they're hearing it like they've never heard it before, because Feynman is explaining it from starting at a kindergartner's level understanding of physics, matter, and the universe. And that joy of explication is teaching, but it is a form of your own understanding too. And I think it sounds like teaching when I'm doing it, but really I'm trying to make sure that I'm explaining it and understanding it most deeply for myself.
Yeah, that's great. I always remember the day when I recognized that even though I'd studied English for many, many years and gotten advanced degrees, I really only learned grammar when I was teaching freshman composition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you knew it before you taught it, but something about teaching
Yeah.
it makes you learn it more deeply. And that's how I feel about American politics.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about how you decide on the topics and when you do and how much advance, and some things you can predict. You know the president's going to make a speech today that you're probably going to comment on.
Yeah.
But some things just happen, and then what do you do?
It's the most intellectually stimulating part of the job, I think, to actually do the story selection. So we granted, I should say, we do it very poorly in the sense that our show is notorious for making late decisions. We only make day of decisions. We advance plan basically nothing. We make our decisions very late in the week. We make our decisions very late in the day, and then I change my mind up until the time when we are on the air, and we will have guests sitting in the chair for the third block of the show, and during the first block of the show, we will send them home. That's how bad I am at my job. And it is, story selection is as much a part of the editing and creative, the editorial and creative process as anything else that we do. And you not only have to be timely and paying attention to what's going on in real time in the world, because we're on a daily production schedule, you have to make sure that you are choosing the right thing. And it's really, I find it impossible. I enjoy it very much, but I find it very, very difficult, and I am riven by self-doubt about our choices in that matter, and therefore we are a logistical disaster every single day, which makes it no fun to work on my show. I'm sorry, Julia.
If you're a student, don't apply for an internship. So you're telling me that it was yesterday that you decided to do Civil War reenactment?
Not only was it yesterday, it was the last 2 minutes of our news meeting, which did not start until 2 p.m., and the meeting took an hour. So we did not decide to do the Civil War is breaking out all over again. We didn't even start thinking about it until 3 p.m. When we were desperate for something to talk about in the A block of the show, the top block of the show, that was not, will there be a shutdown over the debt ceiling? Yes, we have to talk about that, but we're going to be talking about that for weeks, and there's no actual reason to talk about it today that people haven't, there's nothing that we can add to it that people haven't already heard. What can we do today that needs to be at the top of the show? And we had been kicking around this idea of nullification. I'm obsessed with that picture of John C. Calhoun that we aired last night. And between the picture of Calhoun and the nullification stuff that's been happening in the states, and Montana having this proposed legislation where county sheriffs can arrest any federal official who comes to their county to do anything federal. I've been kicking that stuff around for a while, and one of our producers, who is from Mississippi and tends to be like bring the sort of southern state of mind to our news meeting, said, "Why don't we do Happy Birthday Civil War?" And I went, "Calhoun! Yes, we can finally do that stuff." And it's not like it's not like the idea was completely baked from just ingredients. We had some stuff cooking on that, but the idea to do it didn't happen until very late in the game, which is incredibly irresponsible.
It comes off. And Melissa Harris Lacewell Perry is just standing there and on 5 minutes notice comes on?
She had a few hours notice. We called her at, we probably called her at 3:30. So, I know. The thing is
it's amazing.
It is good that we are not a guest-driven show. A lot of shows really are. I mean, a lot of shows, the hook is who we've got on tonight. There isn't much that the host is bringing other than the presentation of and creative interrogation of the person who isn't usually there, the guest. And we don't run that way. And every time we advance book somebody, a day or two or a week out, we always end up canceling them because the decisions really get made day of. It's bad.
One last question about the preparation. So, okay, it's happening that day, but actually this morning I saw the promo. It may have been on for a while, and I didn't catch that part of it. But the one where you're on the floor. You may have seen it. She's on the floor with 5x8 note cards and various notes and shuffling them around and preparing. That's all done right that day after you've made this decision?
It's crazy.
Do you have a research staff?
Everybody on the show does a lot of research. Everybody from the interns up to the executive producer.
Do you have writers?
Yes, everybody writes, everybody researches, everybody pitches stories. And we have an all hands on deck news meeting that's supposed to happen at 1:30 that never starts then because I'm habitually late. And I come in, and everybody comes in. The senior producers start talking at like 9 in the morning. I'm at my desk by noon. There's a lot of reading and arguing, and people. I don't like meetings and talking on the phone, but other people meet and talk on the phone. And then at 1:30 or so, we convene an all hands on deck news meeting. The rest of the staff has pitched by writing on the whiteboard everything they think is in the universe of news that we could conceivably talk about that day, including guests that we know might be available. Those poor people. And then I, having done my own reading, add to it, ask people questions about any stories that are up there that I don't know, and then based on that, we choose what our A, B, C, D, E, F blocks will be, what guests we want, and we start sort of running start from there. And it is everybody, there is a segment producer who is responsible for each piece of the show, and by piece of the show I mean the bit between the commercials. But it's researching, writing, fact checking, editing, and I'm involved, and I co-produce every segment, and sometimes do some purely on my own. It's hard.
How would you describe the kind of, people are always talking about, well, what is happening to journalism and television journalism and Fox, MSNBC? People have said, well, it's really a left and right side of the same coin. What makes it different? Or is it a left and right side of the same coin?
Well, I don't know very much about what else is going on in the media. I should say, sort of as the caveat. Like I don't watch Fox or CNN. I don't watch any TV. I don't watch TV. So I don't know.
Mad Men?
What's that?
Mad Men?
I watch series television on DVD and on Netflix, but I mostly watch English cop shows. Yeah. Has everybody seen Prime Suspect? Right? Okay. So, Prime Suspect, Foyle's War. Anybody? Foyle's War, which is like, it's not Helen Mirren, it's a guy, and it's not London, it's on the coast of England, and it's World War II, and it's still murders. So spectacular. MI5, the British spy show. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I lived in England for a long time. I didn't like England very much, but I came home with an English television sense or something. So I don't know that much about what's going on in the media, so I don't really feel like I'm probably in the worst position to tell you how MSNBC fits into the larger media universe. I know what my show does, and sort of the mission of my show, is that when I got my show, my deal with MSNBC was that my only condition for taking the job, the only thing that I asked for, was editorial freedom. I said, I don't want to be told that I can't cover something, and I don't want to be told that I have to cover something, and I don't want you to tell me how to cover it. And that was their assumption. There was no argument with them about that. That's guaranteed. It's written into my contract. And they knew when they were hiring me that what they were getting was somebody who is a liberal with esoteric policy interests. And that's what they let me do. So that's what I do. And everybody knows that I'm a liberal, and I'm coming from a liberal perspective, but as an MSNBC employee, and this is true for all of us, we are all bound by NBC News standards, which means that we
can't contribute to political campaigns.
We can't contribute to political campaigns, por ejemplo. And we can't lie. We can't make stuff up. There are fact-checking standards, and there are ethics standards that we share with NBC News. On yesterday's show, we had wanted to do a joke. Everybody's been making the same joke about a program on Fox and Friends where the two male co-hosts said that you don't need to go to Planned Parenthood for pap smears and breast exams because you can get them at Walgreens.
Oh, yeah. That was...
So everybody's been making sort of the same joke about this. Stephen Colbert was like, yeah, they're right there between the Swiffer refills and look for the stirrups, ladies. Ah! And we decided that we were going to do a fake guy dressed up in a pimp suit sting and send our friend Kent into Walgreens to ask for a pap smear. And randomly wearing the pimp suit just as a call out to the fake thing they did on Fox. Which I thought was very funny, but we are bound by NBC News standards, and you know what? You got to call Walgreens and ask them if they're okay with it. And surprise, they're not okay with it. So we are bound by those things. I also think that the not making political contributions thing is important, not just for that specific issue, but for what it means more broadly. In covering, for example, John Kasich as the new governor of Ohio, one of the things that's interesting about his political history is that he started as a Fox News host. He had a TV show, and then as a Fox News guest, raised a ton of money on the air, and then when he was running for governor, would have Fox News hosts come and do Republican Party fundraisers for him. So he really is, more than anything, the governor of Fox News, the governor from Fox News, and there just isn't, me being openly liberal is not the same thing as me electing John Kasich, which is what Fox did. So.
I think I know the answer from something you've just said, but we were talking about this and thinking about your visit, about the difference between, you say you don't have an agenda, but you do have a point of view. Is that a fair way of describing what it is? You don't think you're on the air with an agenda no matter what the subject is. I mean, if you're going out and doing any of the contentious social issues, abortion or gay marriage or...
I have a point of view and an opinion, but not an agenda. And I mean, for me, this is something that I get asked about a lot, and nobody believes my answer, so I feel like I must have a different understanding of this than other people in the world. But before I was in media, I mean, as I said, I never really expected to get into media. What I thought I would do with my life is that I would be an activist. I had been an AIDS activist from my teenage years. I grew up gay in the Bay Area in the 80s, and so AIDS was sort of a crucible for me. And by the time that I was at the point of choosing my doctoral dissertation topic, I was writing about AIDS in prisons because I'd gotten involved in the AIDS epidemic in California prison system, and was writing about that as a public policy issue, and then as social movements, prison reform, this radical prison reform movement history of California, particularly in the 1970s, the radical AIDS activist movement in California in the 80s, and how those two things came together. And that was, I mean, I wrote a social movements political science dissertation, and I thought that's the field that I would stay in. I was working for the ACLU, I was working for the National Minority AIDS Council, and other groups like that, and that's what I thought I would do. And as an activist, I had an agenda. That was my job, to push an agenda. So I worked very intensely for years on trying to abolish HIV segregation in U.S. prisons, the policy by which people are forcibly tested for HIV and then segregated into HIV-only housing in prisons, in which you end up serving longer sentences with very bad medical care, and you are doubly punished for being sick in addition to being a criminal. And I worked with states. There were 2 states in the country by the time I was working on it that had kept that policy, Alabama and Mississippi, and I went to those states and I organized political campaigns to put pressure on the Commissioner of Corrections and the governor to change those policies and to create the political climate in which there wouldn't be too much opposition to it, and working the media angles to try to make sure that it was the right kind of coverage so the policy could go through. And I mean, that's pushing an agenda. I want this public policy to change. Here's how we're going to change it. Saying, here's a dumb public policy is not the same thing. Or here's a public policy that they say is supposed to do X. Ha 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 ha, it clearly doesn't do X. That is not the same thing as trying to change that. If somebody wants to then use that information to go become an activist themselves, that's your call. But I'm not going to tell you to call your member of Congress or go march on something. I don't do that.
What you say very often is, we're going to talk about the story no one else is talking about. Yeah. And I assume that that's every day, because that's how you make the decision. But I want to ask you, what is the most important story no one else is talking about?
Pakistan.
And why is it important? Huh?
Pakistan. I think, I mean, I'm interested in national security issues, I think, more than your average bear. So, I mean, I would say internationally, Pakistan is still the most important story in the world, and I can explain why, but I'll probably go on at length. Domestically, I think there is a weird dearth of curiosity about the Republican Party as an institution that I don't understand. There's a sort of fascination with the Tea Party movement, which I think is oversaturated with coverage, and very little attention to the Republican Party's future. Post-Bush and post-McCain, who is the face of the Republican Party? What does the Republican Party stand for? What type of conservatism are they adopting? And how are they going to get their way? That's the tenure of Michael Steele ending at the RNC and Reince Priebus starting. Reince Priebus, right? How many times have you heard that in national media since he took over? He's the head of the Republican Party, and it's again become this totally anonymous institution. And the Republicans have this very, very, very long view on how to both get and keep political power. That is, I think, driven by the conservative movement. And the conservative movement and the Republican Party being two separate things gives the party both a group of politicians that are focused on the next election and their own careers, and people who are not thinking about that, who are thinking only about the long view, who get those politicians to do things that will help the party and the party's interest in the long run, even if it hurts those politicians in the short run. The Democratic Party really has nothing like that. But it makes for fascinating politics on the right. There's also this great tension between the conservative movement and the Republican Party, in that the conservative movement has a couple of different wings, right? It's got the social conservatives who are deep but not wide, in the sense that they can plumb their constituencies almost endlessly for both money and fervor, but there aren't very many people who share their sort of far-edge radical right-wing social beliefs. But then they've also got the business world. And that is not a social issues agenda. Mm-hmm. That is a financial agenda. And those two things fit together really poorly, even within that movement. And then when you try to export it to Republican politics itself, there's all this other tension. And that is so much more interesting and important than there's a Tea Party rally. That's such a small part of it. We're all the Beltway media is so focused on that one symptom, and the larger diagnosis is so much more interesting. And I find it endlessly fascinating. I find both predictive and consequential things in that news when you start looking to it that I think the Beltway media misses. And I think that the 2012 nominating process for the Republican Party is going to be really fun.
Yeah. Not about the Democratic Party, that you wouldn't make the same comment?
The Democratic Party...
As a party, not the fact that we have
the Democratic Party, we know who the leader of the Democratic Party is.
That would always be true, right, within administrations.
Yes,
right.
And we have one interesting dynamic, which is that the Republican Party would also like to tap corporate interests, and so that makes them sort of screw over unions sometimes, who are the Democratic base.
Yeah.
Right? Sorry, the Democratic Party. But there is nothing like the conservative movement on the left. There really isn't. And to the extent that progressives, liberals, or any other organization of the Democratic base is motivated or energized from time to time, they immediately fold that into traditional Democratic Party politics. They don't exist as a sort of roiling cauldron of tappable political energy and money doing their own thing outside of electoral politics in the way that the conservative movement does. And they haven't my whole lifetime. And that means that there isn't a big lefty external force on Democratic politics. So sort of what you see is what you get.
I see what you're saying.
Do you disagree?
It's interesting.
I think you disagree.
No, it's a very interesting... before I let you go on, I do want to go to the Pakistan thing just before I let you go on this to ask the question why.
Pakistan...
Why aren't they talking about it? Why is no one talking about it?
I think we have a saturation point for international news, and we have so many wars all the time that we have sort of a responsibility and an inclination that's totally understandable to follow the war. And the war in Pakistan is secret, so it's harder to pay attention to it. But Pakistan is 180 million people. It's the most anti-American place on earth. It has an unstable government buoyed by a structure of stability formed by family ties and corruption. And we've given them billions and billions and billions of dollars since 9/11 instead of waging an overt war on them. And what they have done with those billions of dollars is build more nuclear weapons. They have turned U.S. aid almost directly into new plutonium-based reactors to create new fissile material, to create the world's probably 5th largest nuclear arsenal, because they would like to have a nuclear war with India. They are not trying to avoid a nuclear war with India. It is an arms race that ends with hopefully with a war, not hopefully without a war. And it's where Osama bin Laden lives. And it's on the war that we are continuing to fight in Afghanistan, where I think we will have people for a very long time, is in a landlocked country, and the way that we get supplies to those Americans who are in that country is by driving them through Pakistan. All the way through Pakistan, like from Karachi all the way up and then across. And we're essentially paying the Pakistani version of the mafia to do that. It's a disaster. It's not a disaster waiting to happen. It's an extant disaster that has been unfolding for the last 10 years, and we can't get our heads around it.
Are you doing shows on it regularly?
I had a visa to go to Pakistan. It was hard with the whole Raymond Davis controversy there, the CIA contractor, the Blackwater guy who got who killed people and then got caught, and Pakistan went nuts over it. That made it that put a crimp in those plans. I would like to be able to do something to try to get some more American public attention to the problem of Pakistan, but you have to do it in a way that resonates, and sometimes it's hard to make it resonate.
I'm going to ask one last question. I've got many, but before I want to turn it over to the students. Someone asked me to ask you what your best show has ever been. What was your best show? And maybe your worst.
My best show. My worst show was this past Thursday.
Really?
We got a great rating, too. Julie, what happened on Thursday that was so rough? It was a disaster. I had no teleprompter for the A block. We write scripts. We spend all day writing scripts, researching, fact-checking, making decisions about what we're going to cover. I write stuff myself. That in particular had been a day where I had done all of the drafting of the script, and so it's a 10-minute read. That never happens in TV. We're the only show that does like a person talking to a camera for 15 minutes.
That's what I mean about the mini class.
Yeah, there's a lot of talking. And so I wrote that script from scratch. It was right before the shutdown, making a comparison to the shutdown in 1995, talking about Newt Gingrich being incredibly famous at that time and therefore able to be blamed really by the public when the public was mad about the shutdown, versus John Boehner being essentially anonymous to the American public, and that larger point about the Republican Party not really having a face. So if people are mad at Republicans, it's a generic feeling that you don't put on any one person. And so it was it's hard to start a 9 p.m. cable show saying, here's something that happened 16 years ago that you already know. It sort of takes a lot of finesse to make it interesting, and I had to do it as an ad lib, because we didn't have a teleprompter. And apparently people loved it. But from my perspective, just in terms of like quality control and stress management, that went very poorly. We also had, that was also the show where we had the guy who's in charge of giving out the permits for the oil permits on the show, and I had this incredibly tense confrontational interview with him. And at some point, I had some other control room director in my ear talking to me about a show that wasn't mine. While I am trying to focus on what this guy is saying, which is this incredibly important thing, and we're fighting, and it's very tense, and and we're blowing through commercial breaks and the whole thing, and there's somebody like talking to me about some show that I don't even think is on MSNBC. Like, and one, counting down to commercial, 3, 2, So Thursday was the worst.
So it's a technology glitz.
That was a technology glitz. I mean, I think we do bad stuff all the time. I think that we screw stuff up, and I've had to run corrections. At one point, I mixed up whether or not it was the Bill of Rights or the Constitution that had a preamble. And I had to do this whole apology to we make corrections all the time. Whenever you have to make a correction, there's the humiliation factor there. In terms of best show, I hope it's still to come. I enjoy the show when things go well. There are things that we have done that I am very proud of. But it's easier for me to remember the stuff that goes wrong than it is the stuff that goes right.
Yeah, like all of us. Actually, aside from the real answer to that, which would be yours about content, it looks to me, notwithstanding what you said in the beginning about looking at the camera and no one is in the studio.
The robot, yeah.
Right. But it looks to me as if you have the very best time, even though you look as if you're having a great time every night, the very best time when you've got a live audience and you're in a bar in Boston or you're at the Y in New York with that audience, and it just, the energy of that seems to be even an extra. And
it's the kind of energy that burns, though. Like after those live shows, you know how people talk about like, I shouldn't be that self-aggrandizing, but there is it is totally intoxicating to be doing a show with all that energy around tons of people in a bar at the 92nd Street Y or something like that. It is great. And then afterwards, I am a puddle of like lifeless egolessness. Like it's very exhilarating and then very draining. It's equal and opposite reaction. And while that is great to do every once in a while, the daily production schedule is hard enough than to have to deal with that sort of adrenaline come down at the end of it every day. I definitely could not pull that off.
That's interesting, because I've wondered, as I've seen you do those shows, whether you wouldn't prefer to do non-studio shows all the time.
Yeah. No, I can't. No. It's great in the moment, but it's, You can't do it too often. It is. I mean, anybody's ever worked. It's not just TV. Like if you've worked in daily production in a newspaper schedule or anything else where you need to produce, broadcast, or put something out to the world every single day, regardless of what happened the day before and regardless of what's happening the next day, you have to be able to pace yourself in terms of your stress. And we work really, really, really long days and very stressful days. And I assume this is something that even if the TV gods would let me do this for a long time, I don't think that I'm capable of doing this for a long time. I think it is very hard. I will do it as long as they let me. I keep assuming I'm going to get fired any minute. And so every day, it's my last chance. But it would, I mean, people who do this job for 30 years, I have incredible admiration for. Incredible. It's hard.
Well, there's nobody in this audience, I'll bet, who isn't just expecting that you will do it for a very long time and would go into their own personal depression if you stop doing it.
That's nice of you to say. Thank you.
As I mentioned before, we have a number of students who have questions. We're going to ask them to come to the microphone now, starting with Dave Anderson, and then we will, after that, we will open it. Dave Anderson, who is a graduate student in political science, and I'm going to humiliate him by announcing that he's a graduate student today. By tomorrow afternoon, he might be Dr. Anderson.
Oh, congratulations. Wonderful. That's great.
If he does well in his defense.
I'm sure he will.
So, good morning, thanks for being here. My question is that in the past 30 years of American politics, it seems like we've kind of stagnated. We've had a generation where every election, politicians from both parties kind of reopen the same old canned issues and ideals. We have Republicans saying they need to cut taxes and increase defense spending. Democrats saying they need to increase social services spending, regardless of the situation. And then whoever gets in there, we don't really see much happen. We just see America get more jaded, a little bit more partisan, more bitter about politics. This has been going on for a generation. Do you see anything in the future generation, like the students in Rutgers and colleges and universities across America, that suggest that maybe the future generation will do better with politics, will change the way things happen?
Yes. And that's a good
Next question.
Yeah. I think there are some green shoots in terms of change, and I don't just mean change toward the liberal side or change toward the conservative side, but change in things getting sort of dislocated from the blue-red axis. And one of those would be actually the issue of defense spending. To have the F-22 get canceled, to have the spare engine for the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter get canceled, to have defense, particularly weapons projects that are clearly pork designed, right, where you've got one thing, but it's manufactured in 400 different congressional districts. Why is that? So it can never be cut. To have that become a punchline, it's something that both Democrats and Republicans make fun of and don't like and feel like it is a liability to vote for. That is something that is only starting to change, but it is starting to change. And I really think that it actually took decades of people making fun of it before people started to actually get embarrassed about it. But it's working. The F-22 did get killed. The F-35 second engine did get killed despite lobbying by GE through this weekend to try to get that that engine funded. Even in this bridge agreement that they just came up with. And so that's one of those issues where I feel like whatever's driving it, whether it's because you're a peacenik or it's because you think it's a misappropriation of American priorities to have half of all of our spending be on defense and half of the world's defense spending be our own, or whether you think that pork is embarrassing or whatever it is, you can come at that issue from a lot of different ideological places and move forward on it in a way where the divide ends up being old thinking versus new thinking rather than right thinking versus left thinking. And that's one of those issues that makes me feel like things might change. It also, I think there's actually a lot in defense and national security that could be that way. The 2 million people who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan are going to be an incredible political and intellectual resource for this nation coming back from this decade of war that we've had them fight so disproportionately with this very radical reorientation of military strategy toward counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency is a very big government way to think about what the United States is capable of. And to have the sort of traditionally conservative small c conservative mindset of the military officer corps both develop and then have to try to live through this idea of massive military capacity. Counterinsurgency implies that not only can we kill people we don't like, but we can build governments anywhere in the world by force of 19-year-olds with guns. That is going to change, I think, the intellectual and moral firepower of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans over our generation is going to, I think, change our thinking about national defense policy and the use of the military. So that stuff I think about could be a big change. We just found out last night, Hillary Clinton announced that the president will be giving a major address on the Arab Spring, about the revolutions in the Arab world and how America will think of itself in the world in relation to those revolutions. That, I think, potentially has a completely reorienting effect on what it means to be not just a neoconservative, but a conservative in policy, as well as a liberal. So I do see some stuff as dislocating. And maybe you have to be interested in national security and international affairs in order to care about that stuff. So I live in hope that it will become funny that by reducing tax revenues, you think you can increase tax revenues. But my guess is that in 30 years, people will still be trying to get away with that. Thanks. Congratulations.
Thank you. Monica Palta, who was a graduate student in ecology and evolution. Monica?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming. So I was curious about how much of your job is spent worrying about ratings. Do you think that your show would change substantially if you didn't have to worry about sponsorship or commercials? And do you think that the U.S. media would benefit from something like the BBC that they have in the UK?
Good question. We definitely think about ratings just because it is a measure of how much power we have in the world. Honestly, it's sort of office politics. It helps us book other guests if we're going after a specific guest or something, or if we're going after company resources, or I want to get somebody health insurance on the staff, or whatever it is, like being able to say we're the highest rated X, or we're the best on the network, or we're the only people catching some other network or something like that. It honestly is that's our political capital in the industry, is our ratings. So we pay attention to that regard. We have found that, and I was sort of warned about this when I started the gig, that there is a tendency, the ratings come out at approximately 4:01 p.m. every day. Not that I've got my mind on that or anything. But when they do, there is this inclination of okay, what rated yesterday? Let's do that again. Or what didn't rate yesterday? Let's not do that. And that's sort of a natural reaction when you see those things because you want to get good ratings, but it doesn't work. If you try to change your show in order to chase ratings, it does not work. The only way to chase ratings is to do great shows. And you can't do great shows by basing them on what rates. So I felt like I got good advice from people who'd been in the business before me, who told me about that. In terms of sponsorship and commercials, it is a great luxury to me that not only do I not think about it, I am prohibited from thinking about it. There is a 100% wall between me and the revenue side of what I do. So I am vaguely aware of who may be sponsoring the show in some sense that I'll see people tweet about something ironic like Rachel's making fun of fracking and there's a natural gas ad or something. But other than people tweeting about that, I would never know it. And the company does not make us aware of it. And even when it comes to the corporate ownership of MSNBC, this GE thing, the Joint Strike Fighter engine and nuclear power plants, it's guess who's not towing the GE line? But we don't hear about it. It's just not, it's something that people put on us a lot. Whenever I take a political position that some commentator, some critic doesn't like, depending on their level of maturity, they will often ascribe whatever position I've taken that they don't like as to be something that my corporate overlords told me to say. And I understand the temptation, but you got to blame me. So in terms of the BBC, I think that, as I say, like, I love British cop shows. And would they be as good as they are if they had to worry about whether or not they were going to make it past their pilot episode because their ratings weren't good enough for their first week? I don't know. I think that in some cases there is, particularly for creative work, there is some value in insulating people from market forces, at least until the point where they can prove themselves. And that provability is something that you can do by being independently financed and massively wealthy. I mean, how did Steve Forbes run for president, right? But
Don't the British cop shows have to worry about the Queen offending the Queen?
Yeah, I guess you could worry about the Queen offending the Queen. Yeah, and I think the BBC does very good journalistic work. I think Al Jazeera does very good journalistic work. I think NBC does very good journalistic work. So I want there to be full-time professional reporters and editors who are not doing it as a hobby, who are getting well paid, who are dealing with professional licensure and professional requirements and expectations that are of a very high standard. And I think you can do that in any number of different fiscal arrangements.
Great, thank you. Next student, Bobby Irvin. Bobby is, if you want to pass the mic to Bobby, Bobby is majoring in political science and Chinese.
Thank you for coming. My question is, as an open member of the LGBT community, how has that affected the way you report? How has it affected your following, your popularity? And secondly, how have you used that, not to create an agenda, but to kind of bring a focus to those issues and maybe help them, in the media and kind of push them and, be an activist yourself?
Can you all hear these questions? Yeah? Okay, thank you.
In terms of how it has affected me, it's a little bit like Ruth's earlier question about how MSNBC fits into the media. Like, I'm sort of in the worst possible position to tell. I've never done my job as a straight person. So I don't know how I can't compare. That's the thing. I mean, I've been out my whole life, my whole adult life. I came out when I was 17, and so I have never lived as an adult person who was in the closet or who was straight. So I don't know what it'd be like. I mean, I can sort of counterfactual. I can imagine all sorts of ways it might have been different had I not been gay, but I don't know what they are. I don't know what those ways are. In terms of how the effect of my being gay and the coverage of gay issues, again, even, on gay issues, like all issues, I don't have an agenda that I am pursuing. I don't perceive myself to be either an activist or an advocate, although a lot of people read what I am doing that way. It's not what I am trying to do. And I think that's as true for gay issues as any. I would say, if anything, being openly gay, to the extent that people are aware of it, and you'd be surprised, like, there are people who, who either I meet in the world or who post stuff on Twitter or who blog about the show or whatever, who have no idea that I'm gay, which I find hysterical.
Trying to get you a date, fix you up.
Well, yeah, or if you put into Google, is Rachel Maddow, you get gay, is Rachel Maddow Jewish, is Rachel Maddow married? And I don't think they mean gay married. A lot of people don't know, so I don't know. I think that's hysterical, because look at me. But if anything, I think being openly gay may undercut any political impact of sympathetic coverage we give to gay political issues, because I think people assume that I'm only covering it because I'm gay. So, I mean, if there's anything out there, I'd say it's in that direction. People think that I'm covering something because it's personal rather than covering something because it's important. But again, I'm not making decisions about what to cover because of what I'm trying to change in the world. I'm making decisions about what to cover because of what I think is important. And if people are going to either overplay it or underplay it because of who I am, it's sort of it's your call. It's not my. I can't really think about it that way. Thank you, though.
Okay, next one from Anna Zylik. Anna is a junior who is majoring in a long list of things: women's and gender studies, journalism, and media studies.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
So as a successful woman in a field traditionally dominated by men, do you feel a responsibility to give women more representation?
When Greta Van Susteren and I strike out and form our own network, we will. Actually, don't be surprised. You never know. I have great admiration for Greta Van Susteren. I will tell you honestly, I am mostly motivated by fear of failure. In every way. And Julia's like, oh yeah. She's seen me curled up in a ball under the desk after a bad show. And so I really approach what we are doing in a very meritocratic way, I think. So in terms of choosing my own staff and the people who I work with, and also trying to give helping hand when I can to other people in the business, I'm really sort of laser focused on who's good at their job. Because even for my show, yes, I'm openly gay and I'm one of the only women in primetime, and I'm younger than most people who are doing the job, and all of those different things, and that's great. But if with all of those things being true about me, I then do a crappy show, then I am not advancing the cause of the next generation of people who are female, gay, young, or any of the other things that I represent in getting the next gig too. So I've always sort of felt like, in terms of being a pioneer, you don't really count as a pioneer if you personally do something that nobody has done before, or get an opportunity to do something that nobody's done before, but then you fail. You count as a pioneer when you do it and you succeed, and you thereby clear the path for other people to follow in your footsteps, because you've proven it possible.
Big responsibility.
It is a big responsibility, but it also dovetails with how I think about my job anyway. I mean, I do my job in public, so failing is really
A little embarrassed.
is embarrassing. I am driven by I feel like I am on a high wire.
I always think of this line, and people I work with are bored with me saying it already, but there's a line in Eleanor Roosevelt's autobiography where she talks about when President Truman sent her to the UN, and she was aware that she was a woman going to the UN on behalf of the United States, and she said, if I fail, I'm afraid it will be seen as all women's failure. And that's a comment that you hear from people who are the first or one of the few all the time, that they carry that extra responsibility with them, and they're very aware of it.
And there is, it's not all bad. I mean, there's also the exalted side of that, which is that when she succeeds for all women, and that's the side of it that makes it worth the risk.
You're doing a good job for all of it.
Oh, thank you.
Next one, Alex Cohen. Alex is a senior and a major in philosophy and political science. Alex.
Hello, Rachel. Good morning. I have a fiscal question for you. Government payouts, which include Medicare, unemployment insurance, Social Security, make up more than 1/3 of wages and salaries today, which is up from 21% in 2000 and 10% in 1960. And while these benefits tend to rise during times of economic crisis, some critics argue that we're on an unsustainable fiscal path. So my question is, do you believe that states like Ohio, Wisconsin, New Jersey, and now the federal government are on the right track in moving towards economic austerity? Or do you believe these proposed budget cuts have been draconian and at the expense of the American worker? And what is the basis for your position? Thank you.
Thank you very much. What do you think?
I defer to my elders.
You think what?
I defer to my elders.
Ow!
Wise.
I just had a birthday that's very painful. I wonder if Draco is psyched with what draconian has come to mean. I think that in times of recession and economic calamity, it should be expected that governments will run deficits. I think that's what deficit spending is for. And I think that is because the way that supply and demand works in an economy that is integrated in the way that ours is that when people are broke and when unemployment is high, and among other things, consumer spending ebbs in a way that causes further unemployment and further economic crimping on the demand side, there has to be an entity in the economy that can make that up. And you make that up, honestly, with government spending. And government spending more than it takes in is something that I think strikes us as both morally unsustainable and financially unsustainable in the long run. And that's why it's important that in economic boom times, you dial the deficit back. And so when the economy is doing well and when you don't have a demand side problem in the economy, that's when you can trim not just social safety net things. They tend to trim themselves a little bit because people don't need to be taking advantage of them. A lot of the things that we think of as safety nets kick in a means-tested basis, so people only collect on them when they are in trouble. But you also do things that are more fiscally austere in the hopes that a thriving private sector can sort of take up the slack for that economy. That's why we have the monetary policy that we have. That's why it would be a bad thing if we went back to gold coins and didn't have a Fed. I mean, yeah, it's the sort of Ron Paul case against the Fed and everything is romantic. And you can come up with that in the abstract. But when it comes to real life economic contraction and expansion, having that flexibility of government spending, deficit spending, and austerity measures in boom times is something that honestly supports the kind of economic and social stability we need in order to have a democracy. In a slack economy, austerity measures will drive us to, I mean, if we go into austerity measures like a la Ireland or whatever they're having to deal with, that will drive us to a level of social instability that will threaten our democracy, I believe. And so we have a capitalist democracy in which we use monetary policy and fiscal policy as a means of leveling out the social shocks of capitalism. And that's a decision that we made as a country, that we were going to work that way. And you can make a purist case against it. But if you're not going to be one of the people who bears the brunt of it, I don't have that much patience for it. Thanks.
Thank you. And last question before we open it. And by the way, for those students who prepared questions and didn't get a chance in this round, you can join the people up at the mics and ask your questions. So thanks for doing that. Ariel Boucher, who is a senior political science and Jewish studies double major. Ariel?
Hi.
Want to stand up, Ariel?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
So my prepared question was kind of already answered, but I was struck by what you said about Pakistan. And it seems to me that nuanced understandings of these very complex foreign policy issues are nearly impossible for the average American to obtain, and a lot of that has to do with media coverage, which often simplifies and sensationalizes these things to really the point of distortion. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that and what kind of you see your role in trying to promote better understandings of foreign policy issues.
Thank you. I think about this stuff all the time. I think that it is important for those of us who have editorial freedom in the broadcast media in particular, but also in print. But like I have editorial freedom to decide what happens on my show. And so that's this great responsibility that I feel like in part requires me to not pay attention to what everybody else is paying attention to not just respond to what other people who have editorial freedom in the media think is important, but rather to read broadly and try to understand things in a context that isn't just driven by what everybody else is talking about, but is really driven by a broader understanding of what's important in the world. And then, once you decide upon something being important in the world that isn't being discussed in other venues, the challenge is to make your audience care about it. And making your audience care about something that they're really not hearing about from anybody else is a really hard thing to do. So like the interview with the oil permit dude when the other control room's in my ear, that's a story that we covered for several weeks, which is the basis on which the government is now approving new drilling in the Gulf post-BP. And we FOIA'd some information and got some other information from the Department of the Interior that makes us believe that the basis on which the Interior Department is giving out those permits right now is not reassuring. And the political assurances that we've got that the only reason permits are going out now is because it's so much more safe do not seem to be borne out by what we know about how safe these wells are going to be that are going to be drilled now because they've just been permitted. Making people care about that issue, even though the whole country was riveted by the BP disaster not even a year ago, because nobody else is covering it, it's really, really, really hard. It's really swimming upstream. And Pakistan, I think, is the most important issue in the world in terms of national security and human threat. And in terms of actually how much it would be helpful to have a citizenry that was broadly informed about it. But it is swimming upstream to get people to care about it, and you actually are doing yourself a disservice if you talk about it before you are able to do so in a way that it resonates, because then people think of you as a boring show that talks about stuff that they don't get, that they don't want to watch. So you need to keep enough people watching and engaged with what you're doing so that it does matter when you're finally ready to make your case. But I sort of feel like we've got like a stove. Here's a metaphor that you wouldn't get from a guy journalist. Like our story selection is like a stove where there's a front burner and a back burner and 4,000 a front burner on the left and a front burner on the right and 4,000 back burners. I feel like we've got like a million pots simmering all the time and we can only boil two things at once. But we're sort of, and a lot of those issues, sort of biding our time until we can make it resonate, make it stick.
Thank you. And thank all of you. There are two microphones, one on that side, you can see over there, and then there's one over there. Debbie Walsh, raise your hand. If you go to Debbie, John Weingart, over that side. And so if you'd like to go up and ask a question, line up. We will take them one on each side. Why don't we start over there? Debbie? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One piggybacking the previous questions. How much did the death of Daniel Pearl affect coverage in Pakistan? Do you feel that it just put the fear of pick a deity, about going there? And number two, do you feel that journalistic standards in America have been lowered to the point where objectivity is now a dirty word? Your ex-colleague, Keith Olbermann, was very emphatic about objectivity, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm just curious as to your take on that.
They're both very good questions. The Daniel Pearl case had a direct material effect on American coverage and actually all international coverage of Pakistan. You can't go to Karachi. I mean, Karachi is a city of, I'm going to get this wrong. Karachi is a city that's significantly larger than New York. Karachi is a massive metropolis. I want to say 20 million people. I'm not even sure that's right, though. But in Karachi is where, the port of Karachi is where all the shipborne supplies for U.S. troops in Afghanistan arrive, and then they drive from Karachi up to Khyber Pass and over. You can't go there. In Pakistan, which is a police state, they visa you by city. There are no visas for Karachi anymore. That's where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was apprehended, and I mean, it's absolutely key to understanding what's going on in that country, and you are not allowed to go. You are not allowed to go no matter who you are as an international journalist. You can sneak in, but then you get kicked out, and then you get blacklisted, and then you can't cover that country anymore. So a direct material effect there. It also made Pakistani authorities much, much, much more circumspect directly, and also gave them a great excuse for denying journalists access to where they want to be in the country. You cannot go anywhere in that country without a minder from the ISI, from the Pakistani Intelligence Service. What does that do to your coverage? You can imagine. And in terms of journalistic standards, I mean, I think that Keith raised an important critique of the self-righteous proclamations of objectivity by the Beltway media, by the mainstream media. I think that objectivity is a journalistic standard that has been widely misconstrued to essentially imbue with authority whoever happens to be speaking on behalf of a network that asserts its own objectivity. And I don't believe that there is any one such thing as a single voice of authority for a nation in terms of its understanding of the news. I don't think that there's ever going to be another Walter Cronkite. I think that Ted Koppel is mad that he's not going to be the next Walter Cronkite. And so everybody else who he thinks tore down the myth that there could be one is somebody who is an enemy to him. And so he objects to what cable does. He objects to cable's existence. But I think that there is not a contradiction between saying who you are and what you believe and giving authoritative, fact-checked information. Thanks.
Hi. First, I'd like to preface, when Ruth asked you what was your best show and your worst show, for me, your best show was right after the Tucson shootings.
Oh.
You were angry and passionate, and everything you said in that show made perfect sense to me. I don't know why it's not making sense to others.
Thank you for saying so.
And now I have a softball question for you. Every morning you ask on Facebook, what are you reading today? And I'm guessing from what we said earlier that you might mine some of those things for your topics. I'd like to know, when you power up your laptop in the morning, what are you reading? What magazines, what journals, what websites must you read?
My answer is going to disappoint you, which is that
USA Today?
Well, I don't, actually USA Today is not bad. I don't read anything weird. I don't read anything obscure. A lot of people, I think that our show must be mining obscure sources of information because we put stuff on TV that other people aren't focusing on, and I think that's more of a connecting the dots thing than it is finding unusual dots. So, the first thing that I read when I get in is I read the Associated Press. I read the Associated Press, I read Reuters, I read the New York Times, I read Washington Post, I read CNN, I read a whole series of blogs, none of which would be interesting for me to list to you. But it's, I'd say the only thing that I do that might be different than the average bear is that I try to read foreign news. I try to read British news and other European news sources in particular about what's going on in international issues and their perspective on American issues. It's sort of a drag in the last year or two because a lot of the British press has become really Murdocked, and it's hard to trust. It is actually weird. The Rupert Murdoch newspapers are qualitatively different than all other newspapers in the world. They are not trustworthy. And it is a shame to see the Wall Street Journal going down that path now too. So, but I think it's more about having a lot of pots simmering on that back burner than it is about collecting new and interesting information all the time. But thank you for the question.
Many of us are missing Keith Olbermann on your station. So just between us, can you tell us the real story?
I can't. I don't know it, honestly. It was between Keith and the company, and it was not about any of the rest of us, including me. And I consider Keith a friend, and he's doing his own thing now, and I don't have a deeper story to tell you about it. I think that when he launches whatever his new gig is going to be, he will probably tell the world what it is that he believes people need to be told about
At
it.
length.
At length. With perfect and astounding vocabulary. I'm sorry to disappoint. I love Keith, and I really hope that whatever he does next makes him happy. Thanks.
Hi. How do you think that the U.S. and NATO involvement in Libya plays into this East versus West narrative? Because Brazil, China, India, Russia, and even Germany have either not really shown enthusiasm, but have actually shown opposition to the military involvement?
It's a very good question, and it's both raises the possibility of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and Germany, posing some sort of international counterweight to the alliances that we have come to think of as the international heavyweight forces. China in particular, I think, is the most interesting because they're so self-sufficient in terms of their international interests. Like you look at China's interests in Africa, even just in like something as basic as mineral rights and commodities in Africa, and you realize if they don't feel like they need to be integrated into what the international community is doing, they've got their whole own set of Chinese-only incentives. That who's going to influence them? Who's going to pressure them to do anything they don't want to do? There's no leverage you can put on China that isn't something about their self-imposed interests. So I think that's the most interesting. That's going to be the most interesting thing to watch out of that split on Libya. In terms of whether there's an East-West narrative in a sort of an imperialist way about that intervention, I think that the fact that the Libyan rebels overtly asked for intervention is the defining and most important thing about the impact of that intervention on that question. But watching China emerge as an international national security force is a wide open question and super unpredictable and interesting. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
I knew that I wanted to ask a question. I wasn't sure what it was going to be, and then Alex made it really easy for me. Hey, buddy. Yeah. We've actually argued in the past before, and so he lumped in unemployment and Social Security with the source of our long-term fiscal issues, and of course, that's really not the case. What's really driving government structural debt in the long term is healthcare costs, Medicare and Medicaid, and if you look at the charts, the big scary bump at the end, that's mainly because of Medicare and Medicaid becoming unsustainable, and that isn't even a result of government insurance necessarily being inefficient. It's just healthcare costs are just out of control. And you see the Republican plan with Paul Ryan's budget, which is just, okay, to save the government money and keeping the government from going bankrupt, we're just going to say Medicare and Medicaid just don't exist anymore. Yeah, and my question is, what should the Democratic alternative be to bring down healthcare costs and not have, hopefully, the middle class or the government go broke?
It's commonly derided as Obamacare. I mean, that's what health reform is, a very unexciting package of insurance reforms when you look at it from the consumer perspective, but it is a nationally ambitious, get real, get adult plan to bring healthcare costs down, which is the most unsustainable fiscal problem that America has other than our addiction to going to war every 18 months. And the healthcare costs are the only way to tackle them in a way that makes sense is to tackle them nationally. You do need a national approach to bringing down healthcare costs. And you can't bring down healthcare costs without abolishing the private insurance industry unless you also reform access to insurance. So that was the big decision that was made in pursuing health reform, was that, well, we're going to leave private insurance intact. We are not going to go to a single-payer system, let alone a single provider system like England has, or like the VA. We're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to leave private insurance intact. Therefore, we need to address access to insurance so that we can get the health provision world on board with crawling costs. You have to do it all in. And that's why health reform was so hard to do. And that's why health reform was so complex, and that's why it needs to be done federally. Abolishing Medicare and Medicaid will have no effect on health costs whatsoever, except that a lot of people will die when they get sick, and therefore they won't need care anymore. That saves money. What you just explained about Social Security and unemployment not being the sorts of things that lead to the deficit, but rather healthcare costs being the thing that leads to the deficit, that is what the president should say this afternoon at George Washington. He should say, leave Medicare alone. We don't need a plan to fix Medicare. We need a plan to get you off it, meaning get you off your attack on it. And what we need is a national approach to bringing down health costs, and that's what Obamacare is about, so stop trying to repeal it. At least that's what I think you should say.
Hi. Are you familiar with the book The Spirit Level by British epidemiologist Richard Wilkinson?
No.
He makes a very compelling case for evidence-based politics. And I'm a healthcare provider, a mental health care provider, and I got to hear him speak in January. And I was wondering why I hadn't heard of this before. And, you know, most of us, myself included, don't have time to read all his beautiful graphs and charts. But I was thinking about how can we sell this to the American people? And I was thinking it would take the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to hire a marketing firm to do public marketing on that level and on that scale to educate the masses. So if you have any activism left in you and any clout with the Bill and Melinda Gates people, go for it.
Okay.
Was that a question?
Well, I wanted to know if she'd heard of the book.
No, I haven't heard of the book.
Spirit level, which is really the carpenter's level.
Yeah. No, I mean, and as you described it as evidence-based politics. I mean, I don't know what to say other than that now I am interested in the book because you have described it with passion.
Basically, he...
No, you don't need to... It's okay. I
It's
can,
okay.
I can look it up.
Thank you.
I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yeah, we only have time for a couple more questions, so I want to just keep it moving. Yes.
All right, Rachel, this question relates to a paper that I'm writing for a class right now, and my professor is in the audience, so I'm hoping for an extra credit. So the question is, what is it like for women in the television news industry today?
You're writing a paper about that?
This is the title of the paper, actually.
Do you have a pen? I would say that I hope you get extra credit for having the temerity to ask. But as with the gay question, I have never been anything other than a woman in TV and news, so I don't know what it's like for guys, because I've only ever done this as me. Yeah. I got nothing. I think it matters to have women in the network news anchor chairs and the other high-profile, high-prestige jobs in the business. I have experienced firsthand, with a lot of gratitude, efforts by women in the industry to reach out to other women who have potential in the industry and make sure that they know they have people to talk to when they particularly have issues. I have seen firsthand not firsthand. I have witnessed in the business the continued level of sort of wink and a nod tolerance for sexual harassment, even in the sexual harassment against women in the business, even in the context of assertions of zero tolerance for that. So I mean, those things are real, but beyond that, more broadly, I can't tell you. Good luck.
Are you thinking ever about gender, say, when you're choosing guests? That is, we haven't had a woman on for a few days. We better make sure we have a mix of, different kinds of people.
On the margins, it's not something that, like, every once in a blue moon, it will come up as a point of discussion. That it would be either this will be our, 7th straight female guest, or our 7th straight male guest, or this will be, we need more diversity in our guests this week. We've been, we look like a frat in the 50s. That will come up rarely, but not regularly.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, my question is about, thank you for coming, first of all, and my question is about, in light of the Haitian earthquake from last year, the Japanese earthquake this year, and the Egyptian crisis that happened this year, the 24-hour channels, including MSNBC, they understandably attempted to adopt a more serious tone for those events. And my question is, why couldn't have MSNBC made a stronger bid to adopt that same sober tone that they attempted for issues like during the healthcare debate, the immigration debate, the financial crisis debate, what have you learned about tone from those various incidents?
That's a very insightful question. I think that you are right to notice a change in tone based on the subject matter that's being covered, particularly in breaking news moments. When we're covering something that we don't know the seriousness of it, we don't know the full implications of it, you have to assume the worst and take on a sort of seriousness and soberness of tone that reflects the potential historical import of what it is that you were talking about. And so when you see that change in tone, you're seeing something that's real and that's we're all very self-conscious of when we're covering stuff like that as it's unfolding. In terms of whether or not that tone should be sort of forcibly extended to other types of coverage, I think there are cases in which there are points and there are days and there are specific angles on that story for which that is true, but I have always, I think, leaned toward humor and even toward sarcasm and toward other means of delivering information, not as a way to undercut the importance of what I'm talking about, but rather as just an additional way to communicate about it. I think sometimes stuff is more memorable, more resonant, or even more entertaining and gets people to watch longer if it is covered with a lighter tone, or with a tone that folds humor into what you're doing. And so I try to use humor as an explanatory tool, not as a way to say what I'm covering isn't important. But it's a smart question. Thank you.
This is going to be the last question, with apologies to everyone else. Thank you.
Hi.
We're out of time. Yeah.
Okay, two-part question. Number one, about your guest. What about guests? Would you diversify your guests to include more people of color and of people of different classes and ideologies? And then number two, with everything going on in places like Wisconsin and Ohio regarding union employees and other labor issues, would the Maddow Show consider more focus on that?
In terms of whether we will diversify our guests, we do try to diversify our guests. I mean, it's not something that we are ignoring, as I just said to Ruth. That's something that we are cognizant of and that we try to. We don't have a quota system. We don't say that, we need to have X numbers of different types of people. We try to find whoever is best to comment on that issue on that particular day, as we do, with diversity in mind as one of a number of criteria, absolutely. In terms of Wisconsin and Ohio, I would venture that there is nobody in the country who has covered Wisconsin and Ohio union issues and other union issues in American politics right now more than we have by 50 miles. So I get the importance of those issues, and I would put our record up against absolutely anybody's on that. But thank you for your suggestions. Thanks.
I did apologize to the people who had questions.
Yeah,
from how we talked about the show and how Rachel Maddow described it that she's got to get out of here on time, otherwise at 9 o'clock tonight, problems. So we made a big promise about 11 o'clock. Couple of seconds after, and I'm keeping that promise. I'm really sad to let her go. I want her to stay. And I want to, again, on behalf of everybody in this room and many more people who couldn't make it today, to thank you for gracing our stage, for visiting Rutgers, and to invite you back many, many times when you feel like having a live audience.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys.